The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to HDSA's Caregivers Corner webinar series. My name is Jane Kogan. I'm HDSA's Education Advocacy Manager. Today, we are going to hear from Dr. Eric Johnson, who's going to talk about driving cessation and Huntington's disease. Before I invite Eric Johnson to begin, we're going to go over how to ask a question as well as how to access this webinar after broadcast. Dr. Johnson will answer all questions after the conclusion of his formal presentation. However, you can send a question at any time by going to the control panel on the right-hand corner of your screen, typing in your question, and hitting send. This webinar will be available for viewing approximately 1 week after broadcast on the HDSA national website, www.hdsa.org. To access this presentation and all other Caregivers Corner presentations, go to www.hdsa.org/ccorner. You can also find HDSA's Lunch and Learn webinars at www.hdsa.org/ll. Also wanted to let you know about future webinars in HDSA's webinar series. Our September webinar will take place on September 18th. It will cover long-term care for Huntington's disease. Our October webinar will take place on October 16th and will cover planning for incapacity. You can register for these webinars 1 month ahead of time at www.hdsa.org/ccorner. I'm also very excited to announce that in the upcoming month, we have 2 special webinars for professionals. Our first webinar will cover preparing for the health insurance marketplaces, which will be operational starting in October 1st. The second webinar will be presented by Art Spencer of the Social Security Administration, as well as other senior SSA staff, and will cover Social Security disability. Please contact me via email at jkogan@hdsa.org to register for professionals webinars. And now I am thrilled to turn it over to Dr. Eric Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a licensed clinical psychologist who works at HDSA's Center of Excellence at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Johnson has spoken about cognitive and behavioral issues in HD at several HDSA annual conventions, as well as at regional symposiums. He has also been a frequent presenter for HDSA for the Caregivers Corner webinar series, and his presentations have included de-escalating crisis situations, as well as simplifying life to accommodate cognitive changes of HD. Dr. Johnson is also a member of the HDSA Board of Trustees and is actively involved with HDSA's Los Angeles chapter. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to Dr. Eric Johnson.
Jane, thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to everyone who is participating in this webinar today. We are going to be talking about driving cessation and Huntington's disease, or more simply put, how to talk about stopping driving when it comes to the impact of Huntington's disease. As Jane mentioned, my name is Dr. Eric Johnson. I am the staff psychologist at the Center of Excellence at UCLA. I want to offer just a few disclaimers before I launch into the presentation. This talk is for informational purposes only, and any recommendations or interventions or tips that I give today are general guidelines, and I encourage you all to consult with your primary care provider, your HD specialist, any other healthcare provider when it comes to specific advice or interventions for your case. As each case is different, these kind of general outlines, these general guidelines can be applied, but please talk to someone who knows the specifics of your case when moving forward. I also want to offer presenter disclosure, meaning I don't get there's no financial reward for me in doing this presentation today. There's no connections, no ties, so I just wanted to put that on the table. So what are we going to talk about today? I want to be able to discuss some of the common concerns that people have about driving and Huntington's disease, and importantly, talk about some of the signs or indications that it might be time to have the conversation with a person living with Huntington's disease that they should consider stopping driving. And finally, I want to provide some practical ideas about how you might go about having this conversation. I'm sure most of you here today are familiar with HD, but I want to give a general overview as well. As you know, Huntington's disease is a hereditary degenerative disease that's caused by an expansion of the Huntington's gene on chromosome 4. It is a disease that is inherited from parent to child with a 50-50 chance of inheriting the gene. Generally, people who inherit the gene experience or begin to show symptoms in their mid-30s to mid-40s. I think this is important for us today in talking about driving because that age range, in both a little bit earlier and a little later, is still what we consider the prime of someone's life, when they're going to be most active, working, raising a family, etc., all things that require people to be able to drive. It's important to note the symptoms will progress and worsen over time. So things that you see now that are slight concerns can become bigger concerns in the future. It is also important to note that there's really no way to tell how a person is going to develop symptoms, which ones are going to come up first, or ultimately when this is going to lead to a person's death. I put that in there just to emphasize that HD is very individualized. You know, it's going to be different from person to person. That said, we know there are 3 categories that the symptoms of HD fall into, which is motor, or the movement symptoms, cognitive, or the thinking symptoms, and psychiatric, or which is the emotional symptoms. I illustrate all of those because we're going to talk about how each one of those areas can impact a person's ability to drive. And finally, the clinical diagnosis of HD is still made based on the presence of motor symptoms. However, as we have our conversation today, you'll note that it's symptoms that fall into the cognitive realm that have almost even a more significant impact on a person's ability to drive. But all 3 areas will have an impact. So let's go right into that. How does Huntington's disease impact driving? And within this section, I'm also going to talk about signs that it might be time to have the conversation, signs it's time to talk about stopping driving. When we talk about driving and Huntington's disease, I want to emphasize that the first and primary area of concern is safety. Safety of the person with Huntington's disease, who is the driver. Safety of any family members, friends, other passengers who are in the car with the person with Huntington's disease. And for people who are outside the car, people on the road and other vehicles, people who are on the sidewalk, and in unfortunately some cases, people who are sitting quietly in their own home. We hear examples of accidents, you know, on the news of someone drives into someone else's living room. These are realistic concerns. And when we talk about Huntington's disease as a complicating factor, we want to make sure that we think about safety of everyone. Now, the 3 categories or clusters of symptoms that I mentioned before, motor, cognitive, and psychiatric, can all directly impair and impact a person's ability to drive. And we'll talk a little bit about each one of those. The motor symptoms of HD and driving. When we talk about the motor symptoms of HD, I think are all familiar with chorea, the uncontrolled or involuntary movements, the extra movements, if you will. But another important thing to remember with the motor symptoms of HD is that it also causes a loss of control of voluntary movements. So in trying to do something, right, and trying to initiate a movement and trying to reach for something, those kinds of movements are also impacted by Huntington's disease. So we want to look at how does both the extra movements due to chorea and the loss of control of normal voluntary movements impact a person's ability to drive. And some of the things listed next are what you might consider signs of progression of HD and impact on driving. These are all things that you might want to see as warning signs that it's time to have a conversation. A very common one that we hear clinically all the time, and I think people are probably quite familiar with, is pumping of the gas or of the brakes. The speeding up and slowing down. You're driving at a steady, you're driving on the highway and there's no one in front of you, but you keep adjusting by 5 to 10 miles per hour just because of letting up on the gas pedal. Or when you're braking, you feel kind of fluctuations in the braking pressure and you kind of bounce into a stop. So pumping of the gas or brakes is a big one. Another impact of the motor symptoms of HD would be difficulty maneuvering the vehicle and difficulty controlling it. So, for example, steering. If you remember going through driver's training and you're taught the hand-over-hand method of turning your car, that becomes complicated when chorea is present. Even when there's only minor symptoms of chorea, that can become problematic in reaching for the turn signal, in trying to adjust controls within the car. Difficulty maneuvering the vehicle, steering, keeping the car straight. Another sign that is very common that people report is drifting from lane to lane, kind of floating half out of the lane that you're in into the oncoming traffic lane and then correcting. Any control issues, any vehicular control issues are things that we could consider signs of potentially time to have that conversation. I will say as a disclaimer, those things happen even to people who don't have Huntington's disease, but when we know someone does have HD, we really need to look at these things and say, is it time that we start talking about the idea of not driving anymore? And lastly, I added problems checking mirrors due to head movements. Chorea of the head and neck can make it difficult for a person to see what's going on around them. Ability to check your blind spot, ability to look into your rearview mirror or your side mirrors. These three things are just some examples of the motor symptoms impact on driving, but these are three common features that people will report in clinic, and so things that I would encourage people to consider as warning signs that it's time to maybe have the talk about not driving. So what are the cognitive symptoms of HD and how do those impact driving? This one is a little bit bigger area for me because as a psychologist I've worked a lot with the cognitive impact on people with Huntington's disease, and driving is a complicated process. It involves a lot of things. It involves judgment. It involves ability to pay attention. It involves ability to process multiple stimuli. People who are living with Huntington's disease have impairment of their cognitive abilities, and I'm going to illustrate how that plays out in the driving situation. So some of the different areas in the cognitive realm of Huntington's disease. One of the first one is memory and learning. This might sound silly, but if someone is repeatedly losing their keys, if they're getting ready to head out and they don't know where the stuff that they need to take with them is, say it's they're going to the market and they need their list, or they're going to pick up the kids and they need to bring something to school to drop off. If you're forgetting where things are, if you are not able to recall where important pieces of information or equipment are, this is something that we need to consider as maybe an indicator it's time to have this conversation. Difficulty figuring out how to work your car, period. I use this because I had a case in my own clinic where someone's family had got a new car and the person had been completely comfortable driving their old car. They knew it. They'd had it for quite some time. But all of a sudden they have this new car, and it's one of those that, you keep your key in your pocket and you press a button to start it, and things were just different, and it became harder and harder for this individual to actually use the vehicle, which led to increased frustration and some of the other features that we'll talk about when we talk about the psychiatric impact of Huntington's disease. But this person realized that they weren't able to actually work the car like they used to, so that would be something we'd look at. And then a big one, getting lost while driving. If a person has been driving a specific route for years, this is the way that they go to the job or go to the market or go to church, and all of a sudden, I was going to work and I've done it, all these different times, and I got lost today. And that starts to happen more and more. We want to pay attention to that as an indication that we need to talk about the possibility of stopping driving. The next area when it comes to cognitive symptoms are what we call perceptual skills, or how we process information that we take in through our senses. One of the perceptual skills that is important when it comes to driving is the sense of timing. Our innate ability to judge time and estimate time. It is impacted by Huntington's disease and the changes in the brain, and this plays out in driving in several different ways. A big one, cutting it too close, right? Making that turn when, you probably shouldn't have gone because that other car was coming on pretty fast, but you gunned it and you went for it. We don't want to reward driving skills like that. That only happens in the movies. But when people are doing that on the road, this is potentially dangerous. If the other car isn't able to respond in time, if not only are you trying to make a turn in too limited time and you're not able to gauge how much pressure you're putting on the gas pedal, this is going to lead to the possibility of an accident. Another sense of timing issue is merging into traffic. Now, I live in Los Angeles, and driving issues are a problem anyways, but trying to merge into a busy street or trying to merge onto a freeway where cars are coming very quickly requires a number of different cognitive processes to be activated, but a big one is the ability to time it. So people who have Huntington's disease might have a harder time timing the merge into traffic. And another big one is coming up on a light that's changing or has already changed. It might be that the person with Huntington's disease is barreling towards a yellow light, and you know that they're not going to be able to make it in time. Or the light's already red, but they're not slowing down quickly enough. So being able to time the velocity, figure out the time it's going to take from here to the stoplight, those are things that are going to be impacted by Huntington's disease and this change in sense of timing. Another perceptual skill that is impacted by the changes in the brain due to Huntington's disease is spatial perception, the ability to tell where the person is in space. We see that outside of cars with people with Huntington's disease bump into things more. And that's not just because of the Cree, it's the inability to tell how far I am from another object and to really perceive that distance. So behind the car, where your sense of spatial awareness is already complicated because there's a mass of steel around you, spatial perception is going to lead to problems like bumping into things, bumping into cars while you're trying to parallel park, bumping into the post in the parking lot. Those make me worried when anyone's doing that, but when someone has Huntington's disease, I become concerned because are they not able to differentiate where they are in space or really identify where they're in space? Running into curbs is another one. It might sound like a common thing, but when someone has Huntington's disease and they're continually dinging up the hubcaps, this is something we need to consider. I'm going to go back a step to the bumping into things. A sign that it might be time to consider talking about the impact of Huntington's disease on driving and stopping driving, even if the person isn't telling you that they're running into things. If you walk out and you look at the car and there's lots of little dents and scrapes that are just accumulating over time, that is evidence that that the person is experiencing some of these difficulties, running into curbs, running into posts, running into other cars. I included hitting the garage wall when you're pulling into park. These things happen, and they're not always reported. So if you see body damage to the car that's accumulating over time, that might be indication these things are occurring, even if it's not being reported. Another spatial perception issue that kind of ties into the timing issue I mentioned about pulling into lights and maybe not slowing down in time is tailgating. People with HD might not be able to judge the distance between themselves and the car in front of them, and oftentimes will be tailgating, riding the bumper of the car in front of them. Sometimes the opposite is true too, which is they have too much space between them and the car in front of them. So you want to look for things like that. Tailgating I emphasize just because it's a little more dangerous because it can lead to a greater likelihood of accident. Near misses. This is something we pay a lot of attention to in clinic when we talk to people about issues they might have while driving. Well, no, I've never been in an accident. And then the spouse or family member might say, well, but you've had a lot of close calls, or, there was that time last week where you did have to swerve off to the side of the road to avoid hitting the car in front of you. While a person might not be reporting motor vehicle accidents, they might be experiencing these quote-unquote near misses. So we want to see if there's any history of that. If there's talk or if someone presents, yeah, this happened while I was driving to the market today, we got to take those things into account. And then Fender Benders. Very common here, again, in Los Angeles, and I think in a lot of populated areas, but for a person who has Huntington's disease, if they are running into another car at a stoplight, even if it's a mild fender bender, we have to look at this as an indication that they're not able to tell where they are in space. And again, this goes to time perception as well. But if we're seeing evidence of things like fender benders, these are concerns that we have about a person's ability to drive and indicates that we should begin having this conversation. Another big area in the cognitive spectrum of Huntington's disease is what we call executive functioning. Now, executive functioning is basically, we call it, it's higher order cognitive processes, kind of the boss of the brain, the manager. This is the ability to organize and to identify things and make decisions. One of the big areas with executive functioning is the area of attention. And how does that play out in driving? Well, distractibility is a big concern in people with Huntington's disease. While driving, they might not be paying attention or even seeing the street signs, the speed limit sign, a stop sign, a yield sign, or the traffic light. Because of distractibility or the inability to pay attention, a person with Huntington's disease might report that they're not always seeing indicators on the side of the road. Now, for caregivers, and this is the Caregivers Corner webinar, for people who might be in the car with a person with HD and say, oh my God, you just blew through that stop sign, or didn't you see the sign on the road back there that said road work ahead? If you get any of those indications, it might be that the person isn't able to attend to or to see and recognize the signs that they see along the way. Another thing with distractibility is sometimes you might pay too much attention to what's going on outside the car. We call the phenomena looky-loos out here, but if you drive by an accident and all of a sudden the person's turning their head looking over the shoulder to see what's going on behind them, this puts them in a potentially dangerous situation because they're now not paying attention to the road in front of them. Another aspect of attention is multitasking, or what we call divided attention. Say the person with HD is not working, but is helping with childcare. This is a very common thing that I hear, and I know this does occur, but if the person is driving the kids to school and is reporting that it's getting harder and harder to handle the kids in the back seat of the car because they're yapping away or they're yelling or singing or fighting or whatever it is that kids are doing, that's going to draw attention away from the person's ability to focus on the road. And they can easily become overwhelmed by multiple stimuli. I use the example of driving kids to school because this is a common concern that we hear is family members have a need for the person with Huntington's disease to be able to do this, but it becomes a concern when it is the safety of others in the vehicle at the same time. Another idea, another example of dealing with multitasking or divided attention is changing lanes. And I just added it to make it a little bit more complicated. Changing lanes while approaching a stoplight. There's multiple things going on in my example. You are having to slow down. You're having to look for cars over your shoulder and check your blind spots and navigate into the other lane. These things become more and more difficult for the person living with Huntington's disease because of the impact on cognitive function and this ability to have divided attention. This last point. This is not just for people with HD, obviously. It's something we know is happening more and more where people become distracted or are trying to pay attention to what's going on their phone while behind the wheel. But when it comes to someone who's living with Huntington's disease, using a cell phone while driving is never a good idea for someone who doesn't have Huntington's disease. Cell phone use while driving is not a good idea. So I want to just emphasize that point, but really to say if a person does have Huntington's disease, this is something that is highly recommended that they do not do, and know that it's going to have a direct impact on a person's ability to pay attention to the road, to their environment around them, etc. The last cognitive component that I'm going to talk about here is another executive functioning area, judgment and decision making. Again, this is the ability to weigh out options, to weigh out possibilities and probabilities, and to choose the best one for the situation. I gave the example before of a timing thing of the person cutting it too close, trying to make a left-hand turn. That's the same thing that's also an issue when it comes to judgment. Should I have attempted that turn in the first place? Another example is speeding across an intersection. If you're at a four-way stop and a person decides, I've waited long enough and just takes off. Again, changing lanes is a complicated thing because it involves a lot of different processes, but if you're out on the freeway and the person is kind of haphazardly or erratically changing lanes, that's something we need to look at and consider as a warning sign. Not anticipating something that might be dangerous out on the road. When a person's driving, you're not only paying attention to what's going on in your car, the speed that you're going, the cars around you, how fast they're going, are they braking, yes or no, but you also have to anticipate what might happen. People with Huntington's disease might have difficulties seeing 2 or 3 steps ahead while they're driving, right? Anticipating something that might be problematic. If you're on the highway and you can see about 8 cars in front of you that there's a mattress tied to the top of a station wagon and it's kind of blowing in the wind, we might say, okay, I really need to consider, getting into a different lane, giving myself more space around here, maybe pulling off for a little while because that's something that makes me nervous. The person with HD might not be able to be looking that far ahead and saying, is this something that could potentially become problematic? It might be something you don't even pay attention to. The ability to forecast and project and to look slightly into the future to anticipate and to judge, is this something that might be problematic, is complicated by Huntington's disease. And then once again, this last line sounds very familiar because I just said it a few seconds ago, but I want to emphasize it when it comes to judgment. A person with Huntington's disease should not use a cell phone while driving because it is a distraction. It is something that is going to make it harder for them to pay attention to what they're doing. And again, in all of our cases, using a cell phone while driving is never a good idea. Please accept the underline as added emphasis to that point. Using a cell phone while driving for a person with Huntington's disease especially is never a good idea. So how do the psychiatric symptoms of Huntington's disease impact driving? I think one of the most common things we hear, and something that I think a lot of people report, is issues with anger and irritability. We've talked about this in different behavioral presentations in the past, but anger and irritability when it comes to driving. I think the most common thing we hear is road rage. Whether it is rage that is displayed within the car, which, given our options of road rage, that's what we would prefer. Someone yelling, banging on the steering column. These are yelling at other people in the car because of something that's going on outside of the car. These are examples of the impact of the psychiatric features of Huntington's disease, this inability to manage rage, which if a person blows up, it can start a cascade or kind of a spiral of anger too, because if they're, say, for example, driving the kids to school and someone cuts them off and they get angry at the car in front of them and they yell and the kids get upset and start crying and then they yell at the kids who are crying in the back seat. These are situations where the inability to regulate emotions can become more problematic. Road rage that involves someone getting out of the car adds just another level of complication to the situation. If someone cuts them off and you get to a stop sign and the driver hops out of the car and the person with HD gets out of the car and goes up to the car in front of them, they're increasing the potential for danger and for an accident to occur or for harm even from another person. So road rage is something that is a big indicator. Now, people will say, oh, he was always an angry driver. We need to know that. But if someone has, been gene tested and we know they have the gene that leads to the symptom of Huntington's disease, or they've been expressing mild symptoms, or they've even been diagnosed with clinical Huntington's disease and are on disability, we need to know these things, because even if it was the way he's always been this way, we need to take that into account because of the potential impact on safety of the individual themselves and others. I included some colorful language just because we hear it a lot in driving. A lot of swearing, or the other part of this is quit screwing me up, right? It's your fault that I'm having a hard time driving right now. If we hear things like that, if we hear loud exclamations, if we hear cussing, those are often indicators of anger and irritability and something that we would take as a warning sign. Frustration might be a milder version of anger and irritability, something that might be a little easier for people to handle, but still something we want to pay attention to. Especially if someone says something like that first quote, "It's too hard to drive with all the racket in this car." If there's ever an expression that I am having a hard time driving, we need to pay attention to that. Even if the person says after the fact, "Oh no, I just said it in the moment," or it was because the kids were being too loud. If you ever hear expressed in intention that I'm having a hard time driving, we need to pay attention to that. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. Another example of frustration, I can't figure out where this place is, right? This goes back to what we talked a bit about memory and learning, and the ability to find their way somewhere, to find the person's ability to navigate and follow directions. Oftentimes leads to frustration for anyone, but for the person with HD, it's something we want to pay closer attention to. The last two aspects of the psychiatric symptoms of HD and driving that I want to focus on are anxiety and depression. I'm realizing, as I just said that out loud, I left off something that we see, and it falls into the cognitive area too. A lot of people think it's OCD, which is the psychiatric symptom, but it's this idea of perseveration or obsessive focus on things. That can play out too, where someone just gets hyper-focused on something. And I talked a little bit about here in anxiety, so I'll come to that. Anxiety is worry. Anxiety is fear. You might see that play out as someone says, "Yeah, I'm just not as comfortable driving as I used to be." Maybe someone quits driving at night, but still drives everywhere during the day and drives the kids to school and does things like that. You might hear expressed worries about driving. "Hey, I don't feel, I'm really worried about the way other people are driving on the road today. They all seem to be crazy." And then this idea of hypervigilance, and this falls into that area of obsessive focus or perseveration sometimes too. Getting overly focused on the road in front of them, right? I'm paying a lot of attention to the lines on the highway to make sure I stay in front of them, and I'm stating that, or I'm, getting a very furrowed brow and leaning over the over the steering column as I'm driving, and really peering from side to side, paying really close attention to things. This hypervigilance, like over-attention, is a symptom of anxiety, but can also be something that we see as a sign that there are problems here when it comes to driving. And lastly, the idea of depression. How does depression affect driving? Well, a lot of times when a person's depressed, they're not as concerned for their own well-being. They aren't as attentive to safety because they just don't care as much. I know that's fairly simplifying it, but we want to emphasize that when people are depressed, there's a tendency to not be as concerned about one's own well-being, which can become problematic while driving because there might be other people in the car, and there's always people on the road that we need to be worried about. Lastly, depression can impact other cognitive processes. We know HD does affect the way that a person thinks, but so does depression and other mood conditions too. When people are depressed, it can lead them to respond more slowly. It can impact memory. We know that people have a harder time thinking when they're depressed, so this can have kind of a ripple effect. I want to use that last example to say, none of these HD symptoms really happen in a vacuum either. They can happen together, and they can complicate each other. Someone who has mood symptoms is potentially going to experience a worsening of cognitive symptoms, and if they're under stress, this is going to impact motor symptoms, and motor symptoms might make them more hypervigilant because they're aware of what's going on. And my example right now is just to illustrate, it can become very, very complicated. All of these things that we've talked about, the different motor symptoms and the signs that are motorically indicating that it might be time to have this conversation, or the cognitive features, which I think are very significant and often play out even more so than the motor features when it comes to driving. And lastly, the psychiatric symptoms. These are all indicators. If you see any of these things present, it's a good indication it might be time to talk about driving cessation and Huntington's disease. And why do I say that? Because we don't want to come to this. Ideally, any conversation about driving cessation is going to take place before there's an accident. I'm just going to share, in trying to find an image of a motor vehicle accident, I picked one that is just the car itself. but if you ever need scare tactics, there's plenty of pictures online of car accidents. This is a single car accident, but to see multiple pileups, to see evidence of people who, didn't just run into a tree in a median, but ran into a convenience store or pileups on the freeway. We don't want it to come to a significant accident, so we want to be able to have this conversation before it gets to this point. So how do you do that? How do we talk to the person who's living with Huntington's disease about stopping driving? I just want to share some basic thoughts first about the idea of driving cessation. Nobody wants to have this conversation. It is not a pleasant conversation to have. It's not an easy conversation to have. I just illustrate it's difficult for the person who has HD. It's difficult for the family and caregivers. It's even hard for healthcare providers to have this conversation. I think the main reason for that is driving is so closely associated or linked with our idea of independence. If I can't drive, what can I do, right? If I can't drive, I can't do anything. And we do worry that when people give up the ability to drive, and even if the person goes willingly to give up driving, there's a concern that they might not engage in things like they used to. Since I can't drive myself, I'm not going to the support group anymore. I'm not going to church anymore. I'm not going to lunch with friends. There is the possibility that those things will happen. But again, the concern is safety, and we have to weigh what is the impact on a person's sense of independence and freedom and overall safety. Now, another point that we hear quite frequently is that giving up driving, this is an obvious sign. This is a clear indicator that the disease is getting worse. I can only argue that one by saying most often the conversation about driving is only coming after symptoms have been getting worse for a while anyways. So we try to take away the weight of this being a significant marker, right? This is, oh, now I know that I have Huntington's disease, but I can't drive. Well, it's how we talk about it, and when did we start this conversation that might soften the blow of that. So with all of those things that I do want to emphasize, it's not an impossible conversation to have. It's difficult. So when does the conversation start? Well, ideally, it starts early on in a person's awareness of Huntington's disease. I hate to say it, but if I'm working with someone who has just tested positive for the gene and they're in their early 20s and they might not have symptoms for a long time, I don't think it's too early to start having a conversation about driving then. Why? Because if you can start the conversation early, it's not going to have as much weight when it comes to the time that you actually have to address the issue. Now, this is theoretical. I'm not saying that is going to be a sure thing, and it's not a fun conversation to have with someone who's in their mid-20s and, is just taking charge of their life and saying they got tested because they want to plan a family and all of these things. But I don't think it hurts to start having the conversation early. Now, not everyone's in that situation. I get it. If you've been dealing with HD for a while, it's something to say, if you go home after or if you talk to your loved ones today after this meeting and say, hey, I just saw this interesting presentation. I hope you find it interesting. I saw this presentation about driving cessation and Huntington's disease, and there were some interesting points. Maybe we can talk about it a little bit later, right? Maybe we can have this conversation moving forward. I think it's a good thing to start the conversation simply and to do so gently, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But why do we want to have the conversation start early? Because we want the person themselves, the person living with Huntington's disease, as well as the family and caregivers, to be aware of changes over time. We also want people to be aware of the consequences. Again, emphasizing safety. Safety first, both for self and others. And we want to be able to talk about things like this sense of a loss of independence. Yes, you might not be able to drive yourself, but there's a lot of different options out there, whether it's a ride program or like an access or even public transportation, taking a bus, taking different rideshare things, using taxis or volunteer drivers. Other family members are sometimes quite willing to pitch in. Hey, would you come over and drive Jim to lunch on Tuesday, because when he meets with the boys, he can't drive anymore, but would you make sure that he gets there? You would be surprised how people sometimes respond. If you ask a specific request, would you be willing to drive Jim to lunch on Tuesdays? Drop him off at noon, pick him up at 1:30. Having volunteer drivers, having other resources available sometimes lessens the blow or lessens the sense of loss of independence. And lastly, I want to say, an early conversation or having the conversation start early in the process allows a person to do their own self-limiting behaviors, and then we can reinforce those. For example, I said a little bit earlier, maybe the person with Huntington's disease doesn't drive as much at night because they're less comfortable, and they sort of willingly give up driving on the highway because it's too complicated. When those things are occurring, we can reinforce what's happening. Hey, thank you for doing that. I really appreciate it. Do you think we should maybe talk more about driving in general? It gives you an opportunity to enter into that conversation. So reinforce any self-limiting behaviors and also consider using it as an opportunity to further the conversation. The family members involved when it comes to talking about driving and stopping driving, it's often met with mixed feelings. Why? I gave you the example before. Maybe the person with HD is no longer working because they're out on disability, but the kids still need to get to school and to practice. And, he's home or she's home, so why can't she drive the kids to school? Again, we have to worry about safety first, but then we also want to look at how will this conversation impact, how will it be for the spouse or the family member or the child of a person with HD to have this conversation, and how's it going to impact the person's self-esteem? And how are they going to react? If we're talking about someone who has issues with anger and irritability, this is going to be a potentially difficult and hard conversation to have. Family input is very important, but it's oftentimes hard for the person with HD to hear. To have a spouse tell someone, to have the spouse indicate that it's time to consider discontinuing driving, can lead to interpersonal relationship dynamic exchanges, right? If if it's me telling my spouse, hey, you've got to quit driving, the spouse might just be like, well, you're just being bossy, and that's how you always are. It's hard to have the conversation because of the relationship dynamics that are there, but it's also falling on the family members more often than not. I also want to indicate that it's important for family to give input to the person with HD's doctors, because doctors can be a useful tool in having this conversation. Like I was mentioning before, in some of my cases where I'm working with people who are testing positive for the gene but are pre-symptomatic, we can start having this conversation at an early stage. We as providers can educate people about Huntington's disease, the progressive nature of the disorder, and how it's going to impact driving as things move forward. We can have that conversation earlier. If we're not doing it, you can ask your doctors, hey, would you be willing to talk to so-and-so about this? I think it's important. You can make that suggestion. It's a hard thing for doctors to assess a person's driving ability in the clinical setting because we're not on the road with them. We can only do what we do in clinic to assess for things like distractibility or cognitive function or psychiatric function or even looking at the motor exams. All of that is good information, but we don't exactly see how it plays out in the real world, in the car. So oftentimes we'll make referrals to outside agencies. And this can either be done through different private agencies, sometimes associated with hospitals and community centers. This is often the preferred route because a private agency isn't always linked to the state motor vehicle agency. So if a person does fail, they might be able to say, work on these things and come back and test again. We will say, though, a referral will be made to a state motor vehicle agency if we have significant concerns. Why? Because if a person with HD goes to the state motor vehicle agency, takes a test and fails it, they will automatically be reported to that agency and likely have their license revoked or suspended or whatever the policy is in the states. It differs from state to state, so that's why I use that kind of generic language. You're going to find that there are different agencies, but all states will have processes for reporting a dangerous driver. Another thing about getting the doctor involved is sometimes the person in the white coat has a little bit more influence when talking to the person with HD. Hey, I really think you need to reconsider driving. Okay, doc, since you said it, and the spouse is sitting over there saying, I've had this conversation a million times. How come you say it once and they go for it? Well, take advantage of that. And then lastly, I want to point out that doctors in certain states are required to report a person to a driving agency. Now, there's only 6 states in the United States that do so, that require doctors to report, and those include California, Delaware, New Jersey, Nevada, Oregon, and Pennsylvania. So in those 6 states, if a person presents with difficulties that the doctor thinks is going to impact their ability to drive, they can report them directly to the state agency. So how do you go about having a successful conversation about driving cessation or stopping driving? I am not saying this is a recipe for a home run, but these are tips that can be very useful. Start the discussion early. The earlier you start talking about it, the less impact it's going to have than if you were, for example, to say, you are no longer driving as of right now. If you started that conversation earlier and you have frequent and short conversations about it, the person with HD is potentially going to be more open to the idea when it comes time to stop driving. When you're talking about this, come from a place of concern. You know, it's all about safety. It's all about your well-being and the well-being of others. This is why we want to talk to you about driving, because we're concerned about how it's going to impact you. And then recognize that impact. I understand that you're not going to be able to do the things you want to do when you want to do it, but we'll definitely do whatever we can to make it simpler, to make it easier for you. How do we make this transition work better? Let's see what we can do. Establishing social support, both for the person with HD and for the family members and caregivers. Get support emotionally. This is a tough thing to do. Talk to a counselor if need be. This is a significant life change. And then get social support for help with rides. Talk to teenagers. Teenagers might not be the safest drivers in the world, but if you've got someone who's 16 or 17 who says, yeah, I'd be willing to drive dad or uncle or grandpa or neighbor to his meeting every week when he goes to meet with his counselor to talk about changing driving, take advantage of those resources and involve outside help when needed. Other family members, like I just mentioned, having the kid drive people back and forth, or get your doctors involved. So no one wants to come here, but this is something that often occurs. What if the person refuses to stop driving? One of the first recommendations we make is that you file a report with that state agency that governs motor vehicles. A lot of states offer the opportunity to file a confidential report, and this can be done by anyone, a family member, a friend, a doctor. You can report someone to the Department of Motor Vehicles or other state agency and say this person is unfit because they have Huntington's disease. Because it's done confidentially, what happens is the state agency will call that person in for an assessment. It starts the process of having a license taken away or suspended. Now that doesn't always mean a person won't get behind the wheel anyways, so you can consider some other alternatives. Now understand this can have a significant impact on psychiatric features. If someone is prone to anger and irritability, this can be problematic, but it's something to consider. Taking away the keys. This can lead to outbursts. This can lead to increased frustration, but it can also make sure that someone doesn't get behind the wheel of the car. Disabling the vehicle itself. You can talk to mechanics about ways to disengage the starter, or is there some sort of lock we can put on the ignition? There are options to explore. Selling the vehicle. You have to weigh a lot of factors to say, is this an approach we want to take, but it can sometimes be useful. And lastly, and hopefully in a worst case scenario, can you contact local law enforcement? Can you report someone to the police or to the sheriff? I would strongly encourage, if this is something that you feel that you need to do, to be in touch with the law enforcement agency ahead of time so they know what's going on, and you can educate them using some of the resources HTSA has. For example, talking to law enforcement agencies about Huntington's disease. You can give someone a heads up that this is coming in. These are options to consider, and understand that these are oftentimes much more difficult than the conversation about stopping driving. So if it does come to this, please involve your support network, whether it's family, friends, your medical team, a mental health care professional in the community, a social worker. Take advantage of those resources if it comes to this. So why do we have to talk about driving and Huntington's disease at all? It's because of the impact of HD, because of this disease, the impact of this disease on a person's ability to drive safely. It's all about safety first and foremost. I want to provide a couple of resources, and I apologize, I might burn through, I might go backwards to come back to this if you want to write this stuff down, but it will be available on the HDSA website in about a week's time, and they're actually going to include links, so you just click on these web addresses and you can go right to these resources. Ann Lesserman, the regional social worker in on the East Coast, provided this first one. It's called At the Crossroads. It's a guide to how do you go about having this conversation, and it's geared for people with Alzheimer's, and other dementias, but it's a perfectly useful tool for people living with Huntington's disease. It's provided by the Hartford Financial Group. It's fantastic. So again, I'll back up to this so you can copy it down at home if you want to. Take a picture of the screen, do whatever. These are great resources. The other one is another tool provided by the Hartford, but it's all about having the talk. And then lastly was a couple of pages put together by the Huntington's Victoria group down in Australia, and it's an information sheet about driving in HD. All three of these are great resources. The first one that Ann mentioned, I think, is fantastic and something anyone who's addressing driving should have in their arsenal. So I'll make sure that I come back to that so you can take a look at it later. So what have we done here today? We talked about some of the common concerns about the impact of Huntington's disease in driving. While talking about those concerns and those different the different features, the different symptoms impact on driving, we also talked about some signs that it's maybe time to have the conversation about driving. And then hopefully talked about some practical ideas to go about having this conversation. At this time, I'm going to open it up to questions. I know that they're going to come across on the webinar screen that I'm seeing, and I will read them out loud before answering any of them. I will also make sure that you have my address once we are all done here if you want to email me at a later point in time. So what I'm going to do is just back up to those resources. If you want to take a look at that and write those things down, again, those will be active on the HDSA website in probably about a week's time. So at this time, we want to go ahead and answer some questions, and I'm going to address the first one here. The question is, my brother is 51 and has HD. He is single and lives with us. His driving is very suspect. We don't know how to handle, especially because he says that once he can't drive anymore, he will take his life. Okay, I think that is that's a great question. Thank you for sharing it, and I'm sorry to hear that because that's a very difficult situation to find yourself in. First, because he is threatening that he will take his life if he can't drive anymore, please address the psychiatric symptoms that are presenting here, right? That's what we call suicidality. It's a threat. Do we know if he's going to follow through or not? We don't want to have to find that out, but his doctor needs to know that that's coming up. His driving is suspect. His driving is a concern. We want you to be able to have this conversation and say, you know, I'm worried about you because you have said that if you have to give up driving that you're going to commit suicide. I get it. It's a big loss. But I think there might be some options, and maybe we can start exploring those. He might not take to that right away, but I would encourage you to have that conversation and start it and then repeat it. Hey, you know, I know you're worried about giving up driving, and I've talked to a lot of people, and I actually saw this webinar on it, and I think a lot of people are concerned about it. What I think is important to remember are there are options that allow you to feel more independent. There might be ways to still get where you want to go when you want to do it. It might just be a little bit different. Start the conversation. have the conversation up till a point where you can tell that he's reacting, and then back off and say, you know what, we'll talk about it again later. And then a couple days later come back and say, hey, you know, I was still thinking about that, and I'm wondering if you want to talk about it a little bit more. My recommendation is start the conversation, address the issue of suicidality and the mood stuff with his doctor, because that's going to be important to address. And then repeat the conversation until you can get him on board and get his doctor involved, and hopefully we'll move towards a better outcome. Now, I apologize. I realize I'm giving what sounds like a lot of direct advice. I want to present that that is something that I would say in my clinic. It would be different for your case, because obviously, you know, your brother has a lot of things going on that I don't know about, and I don't know your situation. So I'm going to encourage you to have this conversation with your own doctor. But from your perspective, start having the conversation and have it as an ongoing conversation. Start it gently and repeat it as needed. So I hope that addressed that question. Moving on to the next one. If a person who has HD refuses to admit that they have a problem driving, at what point should they be reported to the DMV for evaluation? I think that's a great question. If they refuse to admit, now I want to make sure that you've gone through the process of trying to talk about it. You know, maybe it's saying, hey, so-and-so rode with you last week, and they were really worried about, they were kind of worried about your driving. They said you had a hard time at a stoplight. They said that you were pumping the gas back and forth multiple times. Those are things that you might try to share to see if they become more receptive to it. And if they don't, consider going to the doctor next and having the conversation with the doctor, because, again, the white coat might help. If that doesn't, at what point should they be reported to the DMV for evaluation? I think it was Adam Rosenblatt who wrote in the current edition of the HDSA Physician's Guide. When should you report someone? I think a good measure would be to say, would I feel safe letting my kids ride with this person? Whether you have kids or not, I think that's a good, simple marker to say, would I allow kids to get in the car with this person? If you even hem and haw about it for a second, interpret that as a yes. Is this person who's refusing to admit that they have a problem driving, would I allow my kids to get in the car with them? If I answer that no, I would suggest that that would be a good time to consider reporting to the DMV. That is not a rule that's carved in stone, but I will say it's a simple way to think about it. A little bit more complicated is just to say, you know, if I'm having this question at all, if I'm worried at all, it might be time to make that report. Again, it leads to an assessment, so there is a process it goes through. I would say you have to also weigh out the situations at home. Am I able to have this conversation? Can I tell the person that I'm doing this? There's a lot of different things to consider, but I would say, at what point should you report? If you are that concerned, I would consider reporting. Understand that I want you to think about what the outcome might be, what the ramifications might be. I hope that answers that. It's a very difficult question, and one that unfortunately is complicated by a lot of different factors. Okay. I think this is a great statement here. Regarding independence and identity, when talking about no longer driving, suggest that the person who's not going to be driving get a state ID card to replace the license. In some of those resources that I listed, At the Crossroads and the We Need to Talk, they do talk about in ways of dealing with this. It depends on the person with Huntington's disease, and if they are receptive to stopping driving, there is no reason they can't keep the keys. If they agree that they won't drive, letting a person keep their keys or their driver's license might make them feel better. But that has to be a case where you are sure that the person isn't going to utilize the vehicle. Or, you know what, if the person agrees to stop driving, let them keep their ID and you can keep the keys, but you might file the key down just so it doesn't work if they were to go put it in the ignition and try to turn it. If you don't believe that the person will honor the decision to stop driving, you can say, you know what, we're going to make the change here from having a driver's license to a state ID. This is going to make sure that you can get in to see the movies you want to see. This is going to get you the discount when you go out for lunch. This is going to get you a great pass for the city bus if you want it. You can make suggestions like that. I think making modifications does sometimes make it easier for the person to accept this change, whether it is replacing their driver's license with a state ID, or if they have agreed that, you know, they'll give up their keys, let them keep their driver's license, or if you do trust them and you do believe that they're not going to drive, hang on to your keys because it's a token, it's a symbol. If they're not using it, if you're concerned at all, file the key down. In the worst case scenario, get rid of the keys. I think, I apologize, I know I just added a lot onto that rather simple and great suggestion, but there are ways to help a person feel better about this whole process. I think that is the last of the online questions. I'm wondering if there are any additional questions or concerns here at the end of this presentation. And Jane, I'm going to turn it to you if you know of anything else.
Thank you, Eric. If anyone has any last-minute questions, now is the time. If not, Eric did leave his email at the end of this, so that is available for everyone here. Thank you all. I hope that you have had a chance to copy down the resources that were given. If not, as Eric said, we will be posting this on our website in the next week, and you will be able to download it then. Please remember to complete the evaluation and give us feedback on this presentation so that we know how to continue to improve our webinar programs. And finally, thank you so much to Eric Johnson for this presentation and for all the ways that he's presented and helped. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Jane, thank you. Thank you to everyone who participated, and my email address should be on the screen right now. If you have additional questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to be in touch. Thank you all. Thanks Jane and Manelli for putting together such a great program.
Thank you. All right.